Good morning to you all, and a very warm welcome to this webinar on how to tailor your CV. My name's Bart, and I'm going to be your host today. So this webinar is provided by FJ Wilson Talent Services, who are a talent acquisition and development service. The guidance that you're about to hear today is based upon FJ Wilson's experience of recruiting for mid to senior level professional roles. So welcome to our audience today. This morning's webinar is all about how to tailor your CV, and I'm delighted to have two experts with me this morning in the shape of Fiona and Anthony, who are both directors of FJ Wilson. So welcome Fiona and welcome Anthony.
Hi, good morning.
Thank you, Bart, and good morning to everyone.
Good morning to everyone too, and thank you. It's great to have you both here today. I hope you're suitably boosted with a cup of coffee. I've got my cup of tea ready waiting to go here. I hope our audience has similar. And
pot here.
Oh, you got a whole pot, fantastic. So a little bit of explanation about how today's session is going to work. So during this webinar, we're going to give you 4 sets of suggestions all around how to tailor your CV. Now, these suggestions consist of 4 pre-recorded segments, and after each of these pre-recorded segments, there's going to be an opportunity for live questions and answers with Anthony and with Fiona. Now, in order to have that live Q&A, please do submit a question in the moderated chat, which is available on the bottom right-hand side of your screen if you're on a PC and probably on an Android as well. For avoidance of doubt, any questions that you ask are blind between you who are asking it and myself, and then I'll pass those questions on to Fiona and Anthony orally. That's to say, none of the rest of the audience can actually see what you're asking, so ask what you like. There's no pressure, there's no judgment or anything like that, so it's a completely open session. If we get a lot of questions, then for the purposes of time management, we might have to perform a little bit of triage. So if we don't get around to answering your question, I'm really sorry. It's just because we've had a lot of questions asked. So I hope that's all okay and all clear. So without any further ado, let's go to the first piece of advice on how to tailor your CV.
As a starting point, I should say there's lots of advice and guidance out there available on how to write a CV. Most of the guidance is somewhat unambitious. It tends to be based on the idea of how to produce a CV that's okay, a standard CV. We notice that actually many job seekers are rather unambitious in their approach. They often aspire just to produce a standard CV, often simply sticking to some other person's CV that they've seen that they use as a model, and that's fine. But the problem with that is that if you just do things the same way as everyone else, your CV won't stand out. So although it will be true that your CV won't stand out as bad, equally it's unlikely to stand out as good. So the logic here is, if you want your CV to stand out as better than other people's, you need to do something different. So what we're going to do here, and indeed through the rest of the webinar, is move beyond the standard advice and provide some non-standard advice based on things that we've seen well. So Fiona, let me invite you to give an example of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. So I think in the context of being applied to a CV, what we've noticed is that people tend to talk about their CV only in the singular, such as I've updated my CV or I've got my CV done. And there's a marked difference between a standard one-size-fits-all CV and a tailored, customized CV to a particular role with a particular employer. So our key message here in providing some non-standard advice is avoid thinking at all costs of your CV and try and move instead to thinking instead of your CVs, as in the plural.
Yes, thank you. And just to be clear here, I think implicitly we've been talking here about the content rather than the design, but could I just ask you what your thinking is about design?
Absolutely. Thanks for that sort of point. With regards to design, I think if you are applying for a marketing role or a publishing role to a boutique design agency, then absolutely indulge yourself with regards to looking at the formatting on a creative level. However, when it comes to applying for a marketing role within a larger employer who may use software to do the initial filtering, we would actually advise avoid heavy formatting at all costs, because sometimes your CV actually won't interact with that software particularly well.
Yes, there's often the software filtering the CVs before anyone ever actually gets to them. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you both very much for that first piece of advice. I think that's quite a paradigm shift in thinking for probably quite a lot of folk. I know certainly I've only thought of CV as CV singular, but the logic of having something tailored for a specific application makes so much sense, really so much sense. So thank you to our audience for the questions that you've submitted. We're going to pick a few now. So the first question I've been asked, Fiona, Anthony, is, well, isn't doing this sort of tailoring process incredibly time consuming? I mean, is that worth the time investment?
Well, ultimately it does take time, and that's the first thing that you need to make peace with, but ultimately it will boil down to the level of enthusiasm and appetite that you have for the role that you're applying for. So this advice, of course, is not okay for someone who just wants to kind of continue firing off their CV from a numbers perspective. This is about being selective about the opportunities you go for and making sure that you increase your probability of getting shortlisted. So absolutely there is a time investment, but as with most things, the first couple of times that you do this, it will take longer than ultimately it will do when you find a pattern and your own methodology of learning how to adapt your CV every time you apply for a role.
No, that makes a lot of sense.
I don't know if Anthony's got anything to add there.
I think, Anthony, your microphone is still off.
I just realised that. I wish I hadn't done that.
Sorry.
I think it's worth saying for, low-level jobs, by which I mean some not well-paid, unskilled, these are what we call commodity jobs, then it probably is a numbers game. You just sort of fire off lots of CVs and sooner or later you get one. But for professional roles, it's not like that. And in terms of the time, what I advocate is people use, I'm going to use the phrase mastered document. I can't think of an ungendered term for it, so I'm going to have to use it. Have a master's document where every single item that could go on your CV is on that document. And then that saves time because you just kind of carry it across to the CV that you need, and then you just move them up and down according to where you want them. Now, my experience, I mean, I've done this myself for a long time, actually. My experience is it does take longer, but it doesn't actually take that much longer, particularly once you've done it once or twice. You just get to know how to do it. And if you think of the return on investment, I mean, if you get a more interesting job, a better paid job, which leads you to a higher level so you can then apply for an even better job in the future, well, that's a pretty good return on investment in terms of time spent. So it may be, because as Fiona says, it does take a little bit more time, so maybe you do slightly fewer applications as a result of that, but actually the percentage probability goes up. So for me, it's a no-brainer.
That's interesting, isn't it? And I suppose in many ways there's an interesting feedback mechanism there, isn't it? Because if one finds that you're resenting the time spent tailoring specific role, that in itself probably tells you something, doesn't it?
Yeah, very much so.
At the weekend I was going to apply for a voluntary role as a trustee of a charity. And on the website that I applied through, I'd already put a standard CV, but they asked, not unreasonably, they asked for a specific CV. And I realised I didn't really want to give up the time at the weekend to do it. And what that told me was, actually, I'm not that keen on this role. It's not really optimal.
Interesting. So not only is this methodology potentially the thing that's a game changer getting you shortlisted, but it's also a triage as well.
Yes.
To make you sort of you think whether this is actually what you want to be doing or not. Okay, brilliant. So fantastic. So two outcomes there. Okay, so moving on to the point that you made around avoiding heavy formatting, we've had a question submitted about, well, what about tables in a CV? Does that count as heavy formatting? I mean, what are your views on that?
Yeah, I mean, the real challenge around formatting, which I don't think most individuals appreciate, is that increasingly sort of smaller mid organisations are also adopting software to do some of the filtration process. That type of software has really come down in price in the last decade, which enables organisations to adopt that as a first filter. And what that software does is it filters based on keywords. And what we have found over the years, and has been sort of fed back to us by in-house recruitment teams, is that when a CV is heavily formatted, it can actually be overlooked because the software struggles sometimes to actually interact with documents which have imported sort of GIFs or images, that type of thing on it. When it comes to tables, that might affect it. It's unlikely to, but the best advice is to actually avoid it, because it could be a reason, if you're highlighting actually kind of quite critical information in there, it could be a reason why it doesn't strip it out effectively. So yeah, I think for the avoidance of doubt, I would recommend not using the table.
That's interesting. So keep it same, keep it prosaic, or keep it bullet point, keep it simple, keep it plain, keep it okay, brilliant. I think that's really, really valuable information. Well, thank you both for those. So let's move now on to the next set of recommendations, which is all around the content of a CV. So let's see what your advice there is.
So we next want to discuss around tailoring a CV, the actual content of what you produce. And our message here is absolutely the fact that there's no need to include everything, and avoid detail on deep history unless it's absolutely relevant to do so. What we do advocate is that you have a master file on your own device for yourself, but not for the end recipient. So that master file can be an inclusion of every single thing you've ever achieved in your working life and outside work in voluntary capacity or sporting achievements, etc. However, when it comes to applying for a role, you should only be focusing on what's relevant to draw on. So it's not just a matter of tailoring the content, but also a matter of tailoring the voice.
So let me give you an example here. It's an example that I've seen happen quite a bit. Supposing you've done a master's degree, which an increasing number of people are doing these days, and you're trying to think about, well, what do I say about that master's degree on my CV? And the questions about how much detail you're going to arrive here. So, for instance, do you specify the content of the masters? Do you, for example, specify the modules that you did? Do you even go into some detail about the mode of the masters? Like, did you have to do original research, or was it 100% taught masters, or whatever? And the answer to that question is it depends on the position that you're applying for, and also the kind of organisation you're applying for. And you have to ask yourself, how pertinent is the information? And what's a reader going to do with that information if you provide it? So if, for example, you're applying for a role in human resources, and well, maybe you did a master's in organisational psychology, for instance, well, that's probably going to be relevant. It's probably worth giving a little bit of detail. But if you were applying for a job in, you've done that master's and now you're applying for a job in sales in a furniture company or whatever, no, they don't want that. So in that case, one or two lines just saying the title of the master's, the dates and the institution, that's fine.
Great. Again, very, very, very useful and relevant content there. So thank you both very much indeed for that. We seem to have lost Anthony. Hopefully he'll be back with us in a second. So we've got some questions from the audience again. Thank you very much, audience, for that. Much appreciated. The first really pertains to, well, what about extra information? I mean, the question's themed along the lines of, well, for all the time I've been writing CVs, I put everything in there. Surely that's what the employer wants to see, no?
I think it's quite understandable, that reluctance to change and modify, but ultimately this is all about success rate and improving it. From a marketplace perspective, obviously things do progress, and they have progressed when it comes to CVs and the approach to that. So the first thing to bear in mind is that often the person who first views your CV has absolutely nothing to do with the role in question at all, has never done the role itself, and therefore it is particularly critical, especially critical, to do all of the joining of the dots for that individual, to really make it very obvious about why they should be looking at you. So sometimes if you put in a overly long CV, that can lose the audience, as can sort of really sort of past detail. So our advice would be, typically you'd be aiming between 2 to 3 pages in length. Don't fixate on the 2 pages, 2 to 3 pages in length, but really concentrate on extrapolating what's relevant in the last 10 years, either in your current role, if you've worked in one organisation, or in the multiple roles that you've had during that time, as well as looking at any voluntary experience which maps across.
Yeah, I agree with those points. I just add 3 of my own, really. The first is that imagine someone at the other end has something like a tick sheet or a mark sheet they've got to fill in, and they're scoring you against the requirements of the job. You don't want to create noise. You just want to make it really easy for them to think, oh yeah, they're good at that, they're good at that, they're good at that. The second point is really a way of stating the same point in different language. You do not want the person reading your CV to have to do any work at all, right? Everything needs to be self-evident, and if they're having to fill it stuff, that's work. They're not going to do it. The third point I'd make is in the world of creative writing, there's a phrase which is, when you're teaching new writers, you say kill your darlings, which means find the thing that you're secretly most proud of and take it out of your writing because it's probably not fitting in very well. And when I've coached people individually, I find people often have darlings, like there's something in their life or their career they're particularly proud of, and they think, well, I'm putting that in, and you think, well, hold on, is it relevant? I mean, in my own example, I wrote a book in 2000, and I'm very, very proud of it. I'm really proud of it, but it's a specialist book, and it's of very little relevance to any role that I'm likely to apply for. So although emotionally, of course, I want to tell everyone about it, actually, it's not going to go in.
So the key thing really here that's coming across is relevance, isn't it? So keep it relevant, keep the language, keep the content mapped onto as close as possible the job specification or the person specification that you might be sort of responding to, and make it really easy for the person to process the information. I think that's incredibly valuable advice, and that actually ties in very nicely with another question that's been submitted, which is, well, what about experience that I've gained outside the workplace? I mean, for example, I think the person in question might have done quite a lot of voluntary work, maybe in the charity sector, and is unsure as to whether or not that maps across, or whether it's even viewed as in any way relevant. What would your advice there?
Well, I think our collective view, but I'm sure Anthony will add into this himself, but it's absolutely, you should include a section on any voluntary work, again, sort of in the last decade or so, that really demonstrates any relevant competency to the role that you're applying for. But that's the key word again, it's the relevancy of it. So for example, if you have done some voluntary work and it was 20 years ago, it's not going to show any recent competency in, it will be lapsed. So for example, if it was 20 years ago that you were doing some sort of chairing of a particular board, or acting as a trustee, or doing anything governance related or finance related, things will have moved on in terms of the governance laws or the financial practices. So if it is, say, in the last decade, it becomes again relevant. If again that competency is relevant, absolutely put it on. It's often overlooked by candidates how valuable that can be to a potential employer.
The example that's always stuck in my mind is I worked with a young guy who didn't have a lot of career experience, and he was applying for a job with a whole list of attributes. And one of the attributes was about awareness of health and safety procedures, and another one was about sort of basic financial management and managing a budget. And he said, I haven't done any of these things. I've never done a job that involved these things. But as we got talking, it turned out he'd been president of his university's sailing club, and sailing costs a lot of money. So they actually managing a lot of money, and he had to appoint the treasurer who deals on a day-to-day basis with the finance. And of course, sailing absolutely involves health and safety. So in fact, he was able to tick those boxes to some extent by putting that onto his CV. But the point is, you can't just write, I was president of a sailing club, because people will not join the dots. You have to say, my experience of operating health and safety policies comes from, make the link explicit.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that spurred another question, which is, well, what about the opposite case? What if you don't have any voluntary experience? Is this going to count against you?
I don't think sort of anything necessarily sort of counts against you on an application. It's all about the comparisons at that point of choice from the person who is doing that initial selection of CVs to put forward often to the hiring manager. What we would encourage individuals to do, however, is really sort of think about, on a more general level, how they enrich and diversify their experience. So what we see with the market which we work in, which is of course, as Anthony said earlier, sort of the mid to sort of executive level, is it's quite commonplace for individuals to give pro bono time outside to actually enrich their skills portfolio, often adding into their careers elements that they can't actually get in their current role. So if you recognise that is a gap, then there's plenty of opportunities out in the market for you to volunteer and to, as I said, to enrich your potential candidacy. So it wouldn't count against you per se, but in a competitive field, it can make a big difference.
Great. Well, thank you both very much for that. I think that's very, very enlightening indeed. So I think that transitions very nicely on to the next segment of advice that you'd like to give. We've talked about tailoring CV's content, and now let's think about tailoring the CV's structure. So let's see what advice you've got for us there.
So let's focus next on structure when it comes to tailoring a CV. What do we mean by structure? Well, we mean two things: the sections of the CV and also the sequence or the sequencing of those sections. How you come to making the decisions about how you divide the content into sections will ultimately depend on the particular opportunity and requirements. So section examples would be the classic ones such as qualifications, career history, voluntary work, etc. And it's really trying to get into the head of the particular employer and the role you're applying for to discern what's essential and what's desirable. And of course, often that is quite clearly signposted in those two sections on a job description.
So let me give an example here. The question arises, should you have a section on your CV entitled qualifications? And the answer is it depends on the role you're applying for. So in some roles, you're expected to have certain qualifications, and if you don't have them, you're not going to get the job. So in that case, having a section called qualifications and just listing them, so you knock out of court straight away any concern about whether you are suitably qualified in a formal role away, that's fine. But in other cases, maybe they're not really so worried about the formal qualifications. What they're really worried about is how much does this person know in a certain area? Do they have the body of knowledge? Do they have a relevant understanding? In which case it might be better to give that section a broader title, such as education and training, or perhaps education and professional development. And then, yeah, sure, you can include your qualifications in there, but you might include things such as short courses that you've followed, self-study courses that you've completed, mentoring that you've received, or for that matter, mentoring that you've given.
And the other part that we mentioned when it comes to tailoring a CV is around sequencing, deciding what comes first, what comes next. And our messaging here is, again, be bold in terms of deciding what the employer wants to ascertain and then adapt your sequencing accordingly.
Yeah, so I'll give an example. I've worked with a lot of scientific researchers, and they might be applying for jobs such as lectureships or fellowships. And what they will tend to do on their CVs is start by telling you about their doctorate, their PhD or whatever. And the problem with that is, if you're applying for a senior research role and there might be 200 applicants, 200 of them are going to have doctorates. So if you start your CV by saying, I've got a PhD in this subject, you're not doing anything to distinguish yourself from all the other people. So of course you have to include the fact you've got a PhD, but don't start with it. Start with something which not everyone scores quite so well on, but which is really pertinent to the job. For example, in research jobs, if you have the capacity to bring in money to win grant bids or whatever, that's highly prized and not everyone's very good at it. So try putting that at the start of the CV. Or if you've got a fantastic publication record, start with a summary of your publication record.
Great. Okay. So thank you both very much indeed for that piece of insight as well. Again, that stimulated some questions from the audience. So let's pick a few of those. The first one pertains rather to the first thing that appears on a CV, or the first thing that might appear on some people's CV, which is a personal summary. What's your views on the personal summary? Should it be there? Should it not be there? If it is there, what's its actual aim? What should the writer be really focusing in on here?
We've really seen this come into play actually in terms of CVs in the last, again, sort of decade, perhaps sort of slightly more. It didn't used to exist, showing a bit sort of bit older now, but sort of going back certainly sort of 20 years or so ago. I think there's a couple of things. People now, firstly, have often a profile on LinkedIn, and that obviously provides a situation where you can have a profile which is a one-size-fits-all summary, and also, of course, you can put in your employment history. When it comes to an online presence, you only have one choice. You can't tailor anything, so you do have to have a profile that is a sort of just a clear one-size-fits-all synopsis of what you bring to the table, depending, of course, on the intention of why you're on LinkedIn or what you want to achieve at that point in time. When it comes, however, to job applications, there is a big difference when you are in the hiring seat looking at a CV, which is obviously just a universal CV with no tailoring at all, to one which has been really thoughtfully tailored. So the profile section fits into that. It's a great opportunity for not to turn it into a covering letter where you're talking directly about that potential employer or the particular role, but really drawing out maybe sort of 4 or 5 salient points, key points that you feel are particularly critical to your application, whether that be, for example, the breadth and depth of your sort of operational experience, whether it be for a different level role, the breadth and depth of your sort of executive PA skills, whether it be your working knowledge of how Ofqual is as a regulator. It's about picking out what you believe is on the shopping list for that particular employer. That's what I would say on that level.
Nice, thank you very much indeed. Yeah, no, that all makes sense, and it's adding into this big general picture of make sure you've done your research, look at what the company or the employers are actually wanting from you, and spoon feed it to them, and show them, yes, I can do this.
I think so. I think it's actually trying to move your head into empathy. It's about putting yourself into the shoes of the person looking at your CV and making their job as easy as possible to move you forward. But in order to do that, you have to do an assessment where you are distilling what they're really looking for. And that's to do with, I suppose, the sequencing, the ordering of what they're emphasizing in the job description, as well as sort of wider research. But it's also navigating, as I said, to what you believe is on that sort of top line shopping list, and then making adjustments in your approach accordingly.
I think this business of empathising with the employer at the other end is really important. And one of the things I'm keen on is doing research about the employer. So actually a huge number of candidates really do virtually no research except read the job pack, you know, the job description, the job advert, personal specification, all that kind of thing. And they don't really do much else. And if you're the person who spends more time researching the context and reading several different parts of the employer's website, not just the ones immediately relevant to you, reading the annual report of the organisation. So one of the things I've learned working for recruitment is there is value in doing the boring things that other people don't bother to do. All right, and reading an annual report is often a bit boring, but there are little gems, little insights in there.
Yeah.
And it will really either implicitly or explicitly come out in the selection process that you've done this work. So on our website, which is fjwilson.com, there's a page for candidates, and on that page is a downloadable resource on how to research employers. It gives some sort of practical steps you can do to research employers.
Brilliant, thank you for that. And I think yet again, thinking of paradigm shifts, going from CV to CVs, I think that's another one, isn't it? It's going from the shift of here, this is what I am, to
yes,
yes. How can I work into that?
Yeah,
yes.
I think there is that difference again. It's getting the distinction in people's minds that there is one approach if you have an online presence, which is ultimately fixed. You of course can edit it and adapt it. So for example, it's quite common when people are becoming active in their job hunting for it to become more overt. If you're in a situation where, for example, you have accepted or are being made redundant, you know, there are now symbols on LinkedIn which openly say I'm open to work. Yes, most of the time outside of that it's more subtle when you come out of sort of the teaching world, yes, where people are really sort of selling what they feel are overall their qualities. But you're absolutely right, Bart, when it comes to applying, unless you really are in this luxurious position where you're a known leader in your field, and then you are this ultimately desirable person. I mean, how many people really fit into that category? It's generally a competition. Yes, and therefore you're looking to not just distinguish your candidacy, but also make the potential employer feel that you are really sincere in your candidacy, and therefore they don't start thinking or perceiving any risk in what could be perceived as ambivalence.
No, interesting. Thank you for that. So just a quick one to round this topic off, and you've touched on it before in the last Q&A. 2 pages, yes or no?
Well, I think the fixation on 2 pages again is something that we as a recruitment team get asked on a continuous basis. I think ultimately no one could care less whether it's 2 or 3 pages. You're never going to get rejected if it expands there. Where you will get overlooked is if your CV is irrelevant and verbose and starts extending onto 5, 6, 7, 8 pages. People lose the will to live in that situation. They don't have the time to pour through all of that. It's an indicator that you're just not being relevant. So don't worry if it goes over 3 pages. Just make sure whatever you're doing, it's relevant to what you're applying for.
I think a lot depends also on what the pages look like. Like if you allow yourself to go onto the 3rd page, one of the things you can do is make the whole layout of your CV more spacious and more relaxed, more white space. And so you don't want 3 pages really crammed with small margins and tiny font. But actually, if it stops you having 2 pages really crammed with small margins and small font, that's probably a good thing to do.
I would agree. I mean, I think again, the majority of clients who we work with would look at CVs on a screen. There are some people who will print it off, but I would say the majority on screen. And yes, of course, you can zoom in. But to Anthony's point, it's very obvious on a document when it's been cramped. So even if you're zooming in, if people have started going into probably a size sort of 10.5, 10 font and below, it means that you're cramming too much information in. So that's the other point. You know, if you again are trying to get into 2 or 3 pages, but kind of going down into size 10 or 9 font, again, there's too much information going on, and you need to look at how you edit in that situation.
Yeah,
brilliant. Thank you. So again, this continues the theme: keep it relevant, keep it succinct, but don't obsess about 2 pages. Lovely. All right. Well, let's move on to our final section now, which is all around the language of the CV. So let's see what advice you've got for us there.
So as well as tailoring the structure and the content, we also need to think about the language. And our message here is around echo the language of the employer to whom you're applying. The key thing here is avoid assuming that if you actually refer to something using a different term from the one that the prospective employer uses, that they'll actually get it. A great example is perhaps the use of acronyms that relate to your current employer, which no one else would actually understand at all. So avoid using those types of acronyms at all costs. The key thing again here is just use the same terms that that employer already recognises. Make it absolutely easy and straightforward for them to read through your CV with absolute fluency and without the need to do any work at all. No need to Google, no need to read between the lines, and no need to potentially arrive at the wrong conclusions of what you're trying to communicate.
So I'll give some simple examples just based on things that come up a lot. Supposing the employer is looking for someone who's good at management of change, and your CV talks about project management, and you might think, well, that's obviously management of change, but it's not obvious to the person assessing your CV that they're not obviously going to make that connection. Or a comparable example, perhaps they're looking for evidence of advanced communication skills, and you on your CV give examples of effective presentations that you've given. Well, if you think about it for a minute, presentations are a form of communication, but we don't want the reader to have to think about it for a minute. And what we shouldn't do is leave it to chance to see whether they recognise that your ability to give presentations is evidence of good communication skills. Or another example, they might be looking for someone who's good at working in a team, and on your CV you've given examples of when you chaired meetings. Well, not everyone realises or recognises that chairing a meeting is a form of teamwork, and so there's a chance that if you don't echo the language of the employer, they won't see the connection between the content in your CV and what it is that they're looking for.
Okay. So again, really, really important advice there. So thank you very much for that. So a couple of questions have come in. The first of these as well, it's more of a sort of an observational statement for comment rather than a question specifically, but it's, well, are there cultural things here that you've noticed? For example, traditionally, broadly speaking, English folk tend to be a bit understated and tend to play down what they do, both in terms of achievements and the way they phrase it. Can that be an impediment if you sort of roll that forward into the CV space in terms of you're not echoing the language of the employer, you're not really making yourself shine?
I think, oh, sorry, go on.
Well, I was just going to say very simply, I tend to discourage people from using what I call bright language, where you're essentially saying we wash whiter than white as if you're making soap suds. Or, I'm a fantastic guy. Yeah. What I tend to do is say, hype yourself by showing that you are the right person for the job. Yeah. So it comes back to this sort of work out what they want and make it as easy as possible to provide the information so they think, oh, no problem there, box ticked.
Yeah. I would really...
I mean, one of the things there is you want to get to a stage where we say, well, we can't really see any reason why we shouldn't give this person a job.
Yeah, I think to sort of Anthony's first part of that answer, one of the things that as a reader of CVs, we and others typically struggle with are quite outrageous claims where people, particularly in the profile, in the narrative, are claiming to be at their top of their game and things, and being, using words like superb, very strong language, which actually, if anyone ever watched an episode of The Apprentice with Alan Sugar when they interview, in that scenario, it would just literally be torn apart. Now, people wouldn't do that, or most people wouldn't do that anymore, actually, in a real interview context. But I think people are on red alert to worry about individuals who are making claims that just are unsubstantiated. So if you are, you know, if you've got lots of examples of where you've, I don't know, increased the return on, you know, investment for a particular marketing project, or I don't know, done something that's very tangible, absolutely put it down in a factual way, but do just be careful that you're not putting yourself up there as the soothsayer for the industry, for example.
One of the common cliches is thought leader. I'm a thought leader.
Yeah, thought leader.
If you really are, you're probably going to have a list of like invited talks you've given. You've probably got lots of. You've been a guest on the podcast and blogs, and you publish articles. And if you haven't got those things in the CV, no one's going to believe that you're a thought leader.
Yeah. But even in that context, you'd probably change the language, I would suggest, where you say, you know, that you're like an in-demand contributor. And where you'd have the evidence, there's quite a big difference there, where there's a little bit of humility rather than becoming quite sort of godlike in that situation, for sure.
Okay, one final quick question that we've had submitted is, what about if you've been with the same employer for a period of time? Is this going to count against you? What happens if you haven't moved on every 3 or 4 years? So what are your quick thoughts on that?
Again, I really appreciate that concern. I think we hear, again, that a lot increasingly in the last decade. Things have changed when, you know, sort of when I was growing up, my parents were very sort of in that era where it was more common to stay with an employer or one employer for your whole career. And things have changed now. There's just no issue with that. It's about showing either one, how you've progressed within that organisation, and that on a cosmetic level, obvious level, would be where you have changed roles, either width-wise or vertically, either or. But if you've had one role with an employer all the time, things will have changed in that role, tools will have changed, inevitably processes will have changed, and indeed the organisation may have changed in terms of what it does, and you will have lived through that change, adapted through that change, and adapted what you do. So it's really thinking about that, and then again being able to articulate your story so it impresses a current employer that you haven't just been static, which of course would never be the same. You've been doing the same thing for the last 15 years. Something will have changed around you, and you'll have changed accordingly.
No, brilliant. Well, thank you for that. Well, I think that brings us pretty much to the end of today's session. So I'd like to thank you very much indeed, Fiona, very much Anthony, and very much to our audience for attending today. Also, I'd just like to say that there's a wealth of information on FJ Wilson Talent Services website, which is fjwilson.com. There's information there for employers, for individuals, for job seekers, and you can find loads and loads of resources there that will be very pertinent to the searches you're trying to do, and also trying to make sure that you're the best candidate, or to shine through as the best candidate for the particular role that you're applying for. Also on that website, you'll find links to our podcast series, which is Recruitment in the Modern World, which again is a wealth of information, and also to this webinar program. We've got more webinars on CVs coming up, so if any colleagues that you know would like to attend, please do encourage them to do so. We've also got webinars on presentation skills. There's 2 today that we'd be delighted to see folk attend. And also there will be more in the second series, hopefully in the future. So thank you all to everybody today. The final credit I'd like to give is to Harry Chalmers for the introductory and finalising music. So thanks to him too. Okay, bye-bye all then.